Thank you. Thanks for that fantastic intro, Tristan, and thank you guys all for coming tonight. So my name is Andrew, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about, just writing React Native code and testing that across multiple devices. So kind of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about is I'll just give you a brief kind of intro to myself, what I do here at Sauce Labs, and then for those of you who aren't familiar with React Native, I'm just going to kind of talk about it a little bit and give you like a little bit of a primer. And then dive into testing React Native apps, and then kind of end it off with a couple tips and tricks I've learned along the way. My name's Andrew. I'm a developer here at Sauce Labs. I've been working at Sauce Labs for about 4 months. I'm an engineer on the growth team, and I actually don't have that much familiarity with automation testing. It's something that I've done at previous companies, or rather, it's something that I've been involved with at previous companies. I've kind of written my components, written my code, and then kind of given it off to another team of engineers to write those automation tests. And I've always been very interested in learning more about it and how that works, which is kind of what led me to Sauce Labs and what led me to speaking to you all tonight. But before coming to Sauce Labs, I was an engineer at Twitch. We had a very large automation team that was very pretty proficient at making sure that any changes we made to the website were still working and there was no regressions. And that it's kind of interesting being able to see what those engineers have done and implement some of that for myself. So what exactly is React Native? React Native, it's a way to create native applications for Android and iOS using React. You kind of write React flavored view code and have it compile to iOS and Android through React Native. The library itself provides a core set of platform agnostic components, like a view component, text component, and that ends up compiling down to the platform-specific view and text implementations. It allows for you to write your view code once and have it run on multiple devices and platforms. And it's officially supported. It officially supports iOS and Android. And there have been some community-driven projects to bring it to Windows, to bring it to Mac OS, and bring it to web. And you might be wondering, like, well, web. Well, if you're writing React, like you're normally targeting web. But keep in mind, so the code that I have on the slide here is all using all using React Native components, and those at compile time are compiled to that platform's specific view code, and React Native Web is a tool set that kind of takes those same components and compiles them back to HTML and CSS. So again, you can take the same view code and have it run on iOS, Android, and web and other platforms. And then it's kind of something that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with or know a lot of these terms, but it's just kind of nice to give a brief overview of the different types of tests that exist. There's unit tests, which are focused more on testing individual components. The smallest pieces of code that you can possibly think of are really what unit tests focus on. And they're on the right-hand side, you can see like an example of a unit test. It's basically just testing that this prop is able to function correctly. And then to build on top of that, we have integration tests, which take multiple components, multiple small units of code, and test that together that their functionality still works. And both of these types of tests are, the developer has access to the direct functions and components that they're importing from from packages that they have access to. They're writing their tests where they can actually invoke these functions and these components directly. There's another type of testing, which is what I'm going to be focusing on mostly tonight, which is functional end-to-end tests, where rather than having access to these components and importing them, you're actually kind of testing, you're kind of taking a different approach, you're taking a different approach where you're kind of from the outside testing that the interaction works correctly, that as a real user, you're able to interact with the application and everything functions correctly. You don't have direct access to the code, so instead you're simulating events. You're looking up elements on the within the application, and you're touching, or you're interacting with them through generally an API or some sort of other driver. Just as you can see, like on the right-hand side here, we're testing that we are able to find an element in our view, and then we click on it, and then we're making sure that, in this case, we're able to open this link inside of Safari, which is not really something you'd be able to test with an integration test. So focusing on integration tests for pretty much the rest of tonight. With that in mind, there's a lot of tools to choose from when deciding to write your tests, and there's a lot of things to kind of consider for your application's use. Something to really keep in mind is if we're writing a React Native application, we're sharing a lot of the code between these different platforms. So it might be worth it to share the test code as well. Another thing to consider is you're running these tests on multiple different devices. You might want to target emulators, simulators, and real devices. That might be something that you want to encapsulate. And not all the tools that I'm going to talk about do that. So depending on your needs, it's just something to also consider. Another thing to consider is end-to-end user flows. So if I click on a link inside of an application, does it bring me to the right the right view in Safari? Does it load up the right page? Or maybe if I have a verification flow where I bring the user outside of the application to verify their email, can I encapsulate, or can I write a test that encapsulates all of that functionality? There's also supporting user interactions. Some of the tools that I'm about to mention don't have a native way to do that. You have to write your own layer on top of that. Some of them do, which is really nice. And then there's continuous integration support, just making sure that if you make changes to your app and you build it, part of your pipeline is running these tests and making sure that it's reporting the right errors or the right status of those tests. And then finally, kind of as a nice quality of life feature, taking screenshots when there are failures is something that's also really nice. So with all that in mind, there are a couple kind of key frameworks and drivers that handle a lot of what I've just discussed. And I'm going to break it down a little bit. So there's Selenium WebDriver, which, as I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with, is a way to interact with browsers like Firefox, Chrome, Safari, and write your tests and tell the browser to interact with different elements on the page. Appium is a similar solution, or solves the same type of problem, but from a native application viewpoint. So rather than using CSS selectors to find elements on a view, you're using some native Android and iOS selectors to look up similar elements within a native application. There's WebDriver.io, which actually targets multiple platforms. It targets web, Android, and iOS. And it does that by implementing both Selenium, well, not implementing, creating a wrapper around Selenium and around Appium. And basically, depending on the platform you're targeting, picking which driver to use. And then some other things that there's Detox, which is another solution to writing automated tests. Instead of implementing Selenium or Appium, it is instead a library that you install along with your application, and it just kind of creates this view into the application for you to interact with different components in the app. And yeah, there's also XCUI test and Espresso, which are both just native implementations of different drivers for interacting with native applications. So with all that in mind, the tool that I'm going to be talking about tonight is WebDriver.io. Under the hood, we'll be using Appium to interact with our app. And it's officially, so my coworker Christian Broman gave a talk here last month about WebDriver. He is the maintainer of that repo. So it was, he's really a great resource to talk to and was very helpful in kind of answering some of my questions. So yeah, with all that in mind, I'm going to switch over to a live demo of what all of this actually looks like under the hood. Unfortunately, my computer crashed right before doing this talk, so hopefully this will work. I was going to show you guys just a brief overview of the app beforehand, but instead, I'm going to just run my automation tests and then show you what the app looks like. So this command right here, yarn run iOS test, is calling out to WebDriver. And it's calling this WebDriver package. Oh, there we go. It's calling this WebDriver CLI tool, which is then reading in from my configuration, describing what device I want to use and what, there we go. While that's loading up, I'll kind of give you a little bit of an overview of some of the configurations I'm using. So here, I'm saying I want to use an iPhone X, and these are all Appium settings. So here you can see my app is being installed on the simulator, and then next to it should be a companion app. And this is this is actually how Appium works under the hood. Is it installs this additional app to act as a server for receiving, or sorry, act as a client for receiving commands from the Appium server. If this doesn't work, I have a video just kind of that with this working correctly. I might have to result to that if something is going wrong, which very well may be with the demo god. There we go. So this should now be communicating with the Appium server. It's now running my tests, and I have a lot of debug statements running. What it's done is clicked on a link, opened up the first item in that array of talks, and then make sure that the correct URL in Safari is loading correctly. As you can see, we have an error here. I've been trying to debug this. It's actually an issue with the querying for the correct context. What I'm trying to do in my test is make sure that I'm looking at a web view before then querying for the correct URL. And let me actually show you the test that's being run right here. So what I'm doing is querying for, so using this accessibility selector, I'll dive into that in a little bit, to look up an event ID in my view. And let me actually just switch back over to the app that I've written to kind of show you what it looks like. So this is just I'm using Create React Native app, which is very similar to Create React app. If you're familiar with that tool, it basically bootstraps a native application for you. And then I just kind of built on top of that to display the latest meetup talks that are the latest Selenium SF meetup talks. And when you click on one of these talks, it will bring you to the actual meetup page itself. And so in my test, what I'm doing, if I can click correctly, is looking up an event based on its ID, which in this case is going to be our first event here, clicking on it, and then telling WebDriver to switch context to find, and then finding the web view context that exists within iOS's array of context, to then query for the current URL. Unfortunately, in my the test that just ran, this find web view context did not return my web view context. But I can, yeah, in theory, that is what you would need to do. So that's a little unfortunate, but yeah. So I think that's all I wanted to talk about for this. Yeah. I'm going to jump back over. So yeah, actually, let me stop real quick. Does anyone have any questions about WebDriver, about kind of what I've talked about so far? I feel like, yeah.
We did have some questions in the audience. People who are currently interested. And by the way, thank you. I want to take just one more second, a round of applause. I think it takes a lot of courage to come up and speak about something that you are new to and you are passionate about, but you also have dived in and you really contributed to the community, and it's something you care about. And public speaking is not for everyone. And you're killing it, so I appreciate you for that. I did have a few questions from the audience, and there was one specifically. You had a question. Yeah.
Actually, my question is answered already.
Was it? Was there any additional questions about it?
Driver.io is used also for Android and iOS.
Oh,
so
yes.
Yeah. And I thought that was a really great question that maybe you could expand just a little bit upon based off of your experience.
Sure. Let me get back to this. So,
And is one more stable than the other currently?
is one more stable? Is Appium more stable than WebDriver? Or
WebDriver.io for Android.
oh,
for
for,
iOS.
so I'm actually not familiar enough to know if one. From my experience, they're both very stable, but I don't know traditionally if one has been more or not.
We can talk more offline.
But yeah, I guess, sorry, I'm just going to say something and I completely forgot. But yeah, as far as WebDriver goes, it is nice because you can write your, let me cut back over to my test here. You can use the same code to target Selenium as well. It ends up translating the commands that, ends up translating these method call or function calls into commands to tell either the Appium server that's running what selectors to use, or if you're targeting web, the Selenium server that's running, like what commands to issue.
Just a quick question here. Who here in the audience, I know we're part of the Selenium community here, I just want to understand, who here has heard of WebDriver.io before? Show of hands. Yes. I love it. I love the split a little bit here. This is good. I feel like I'm getting an education.
Good. Maybe you should write some tests for sauce.
Maybe I should look under the chairs for more stickers. Just running limited supply. So I think we have the questions we're going for this. Yeah, great.
So with all that in mind, so some things I learned along the way. So selectors with native applications don't quite work the same way as they would with a web application. You don't have access to the same CSS selectors that you do. You can't look up views inside of native applications with IDs or with class names. You can look up. There are specific selectors you can use for Android and iOS to find views by ID, but those tend to be specific to those platforms. And in kind of the spirit of reusing the same code or sharing as much code as possible, accessibility labels tend to be a really good way to consistently target views inside of different platforms. So that's what this tilde represents. It's saying I want to look for the accessibility label called welcome, and then get the text on that element. And from my experience, that's just the easiest, most consistent way to do that. There are other ways to do it as well, but yeah. Yes.
This is related to yes. Hello. This is because you define the label one time and it's generated for all the platforms, right? You are taking advantage of this fact.
Yes. Yeah.
I love the concise responses, by the way. Yes.
Question in the back.
I have some question about your file extension, like you say .spec.js. This is a regular file extension for your text.
This is just more semantics. The extension itself is just a .js file, but it's so that when I'm running tests, I can target all tests that end with .spec.js as like an end-to-end test versus maybe just .js for like a unit test or something. So it's more, it doesn't, the extension itself, it doesn't denote anything or doesn't really affect any behavior in anything differently. Yeah.
I kind of peeked around our own this project end-to-end test files, and is it normal that it could be in JS or Java?
Yeah, depending on, so React Native allows you to write native modules or write platform-specific code for each individual platform. So you might, yes, it's pretty common to do that. In this case, I'd like to share as much code as possible, but there might be instances where either that's not possible or the behavior, depending on the platform and the platform's design patterns, are just so drastic enough that it makes sense to write it in that platform's language. Yeah.
Yeah. Another, I see you have a screen.js. Is it a page object based?
No, so this is more borrowing from my coworker Wim's class names and methods that he wrote for interacting with different views inside of React Native. So in this case, this is I'm actually not using this in my example application, but I was kind of experimenting with it for ways to wait for if a web view is visible or not. But yeah.
Oh, we don't have questions over here. I love that this is like a live conversation. You should save questions for the end. I kind of enjoy this.
Yeah, me too. Okay. Yeah. So I've mentioned selectors using accessibility labels for your different selectors. Another thing to kind of consider is user input. There's in WebDriver, there are no native ways to simulate gestures, so you need to implement all of that yourself. There's an example repo that my coworker Wim has been working on, which has really good examples of how to simulate gestures and how to interact with the application. Another thing that was really helpful was just being able to find the emulator. So actually, let me go back to my Appium configuration. So here, I'm specifying all my platform capabilities, kind of the device name, the target version of the OS I want. Down here, which I have commented out for right now, you're able to specify a unique device identifier that will allow Appium to reuse a device that exists on your machine. If you don't do that, it will, by default, create a new instance of either the iOS simulator or an Android emulator. So if you are writing tests and running into that, there's a way to find a device and reuse it. With iOS, the command you want to run, oops, that is too early. The command you want to run is instruments-s devices, and then I'll usually pipe that into grep and just look for, if I go back to my simulator, there's this like really long kind of, can I zoom in? Oops, identifier here. And I'll usually just look for like the last couple characters to find the full device ID and then use it inside of my configuration. Oops. And then, yeah, that's it for this slide. Yeah, so any more questions on any of this stuff, any of the tips and tricks, or just like things that maybe you would want to know, or questions you have? Sweet. Well, with all that in mind, I'd like to thank Tristan, who conveniently just walked out. My coworker Wim, who's been very helpful in just talking about actually writing tests for React Native, and has a really good comprehensive example repo up on the WebDriver.io GitHub page of just how to write tests for React Native and how to interact with different parts of your application. And then Christian Broman, who maintains WebDriver.io and also is a colleague of mine, has been also very helpful. Just saying thank you, Tristan.
I know, sorry, I was dealing with my favorite janitorial staff, who I also would like to give a round of applause for. That was my first job ever as a janitor. I would go back and just say for Wim real fast, if you can. So can you talk a little bit more about how people can get involved? Because I feel like you have been contributing, and these people have also been contributing. Can you talk a little bit more about how people can get involved and who they are?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, Tristan is the maintainer of WebDriver.io. That's a open source project that ends up using Selenium and Appium under the hood to communicate to different, to allow you to target different types of platforms and write your tests. That's a ongoing project that has lots of, could always use help either grooming issues, or there's lots of, in the backlog, there's lots of kind of getting started tasks and things for people to kind of get their feet wet and help out with that package. And that there's with that project. And then Wim is also a contributor to that and has also been very involved with that. And both are very friendly. They were very responsive on Twitter. If you have any questions, they would be very happy to help you out, or at least give you kind of a path in the right direction for anything you have.
And just because I know I'm shamelessly, I'm in marketing, but I honestly am doing this because I honestly think it's about community too. Many of you have a professional development budget, and I know sometimes it's hard to figure out how to use it, how to allocate. We do have an annual user convention. They are both speaking. You can meet them in person. It's going to be in Austin, Texas. I know this sounds like a sales pitch. I get it. I really would just consider, come talk to me after. They're going to be here. I recruited this man, and this one and I, trouble. So like, I would love if anyone here is interested in learning more about SauceCon, like, come talk to me after. It's just a good time. And if you can't totally understand, like Andrew said, they're on Twitter, and you're also on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So yeah, like Tristan said, I'm also very responsive on Twitter. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me there, or on GitHub as well. Yeah.
With that said, do you have any additional questions? I have a question. I'll leave you first.
My question is, how is it related to cross-platform testing for your talk today?
How's my talk related to cross-platform
Yeah.
testing? Just that with WebDriver, you're able to target iOS and Android with the same tests. You don't, for the most part, have to change anything in your tests to target the specific platform or any particular platform. You can share a lot of the same code between those different platforms.
Cool.
Yeah.
You didn't show us the Android stuff.
I know. Yep, I didn't. I ended up not being able to get that working for tonight. So.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Well, no, what I was going to say is the party's not over. We have networking, and we have a live computer. We have other people here as well too. So let's take this offline and let's go check it out.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I'm down. I'm down if you're down. Other people. Yeah. This is so much fun. You know, most people would be like, "Oh, a small crowd Wednesday night," and I'm like, "I'm so here for this. I kind of love this. It's a good captive audience." Yes, I have questions.
In my experience, for Android and iOS, we decided because of the cases to have different repos with different test cases. Because typically, even we have different flows, so we decided to have two different implementation for each. But I want to check if I understood it correctly. when you develop with React, you can decide to have the same automation, the same test cases, because the flow is the same. You can use the labels, the accessibility labels. So it's a guarantee that your test cases that you develop for iOS are going to work also for Android. Is that correct?
If the flows, if the tests kind of target the same flows, then yes. You can run those same tests against Android, and assuming that those components work the same way, hopefully your test will pass. But yes, you can look up the same components, or you can, you share those tests across the different platforms. If you still have separate repos but want to share, you're considering sharing the same tests across these two different repos. I don't have experience doing that, but that would be also would be interesting. But in theory, it would work.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that question. But I think one of the ideas that I think you are the native expert on that. But one of the ideas using the React Native is just one source code, then you can automatically port it to both Android and iOS. So in that case, it's the same flow. Right? If you take that native approach, then the WebDriver I/O automation testing will automatically work on both applications, right?
Yep. And the nice thing about React Native, is you can also, there are easy ways to break out of your kind of general multi-platform code and say, like, for iOS, I specifically want to implement this view, or I specifically want this kind of functionality. In some of my test cases, I'm using labels slightly differently. So with Android, it's an accessibility label, but with iOS, you're using a test ID prop. So there's ways to break out of your kind of one use case fits all and handle specific platform quirks or details.
Should I sing a Christmas carol? I'm just kidding. Who else? Any other questions? One more time, can I please get a round of applause for Andrew here?